My name is Angela, and I am 42 years old. For as long as I can remember, my life has revolved around one thing: raising my son, Marcus. When I think back on the past 2 decades, what I see most clearly isn't my own milestones, but his. His first steps on the cracked sidewalk outside our old apartment in Brooklyn, his smile the first day he wore a pressed shirt for middle school, the way he held onto my hand too tightly when we toured his first college campus. I wasn't given the luxury of choosing my own path. Life made the choices for me. I had Marcus when I was 20, barely out of my own mother's house. His father didn't stick around. At first, he promised he would. He said he was just figuring himself out, but when Marcus turned 1, the calls stopped. After that, it was just me. I worked every job I could. In the mornings, I cleaned offices downtown, scrubbing coffee stains off break room counters, picking up trash that men in suits left behind without ever looking me in the eye. In the evenings, I worked in diners, bringing home leftover slices of pie in cardboard boxes so Marcus could have a treat. On weekends, I babysat other people's kids while mine stayed at my sister's, because babysitting money bought his sneakers when he grew too fast for me to keep up. It wasn't glamorous, but it was survival. And in those small cracks of exhaustion, I would look at him, his head bent over homework, his laughter echoing through the walls of our cramped apartment, and remind myself, this is worth it. Every sacrifice, every surback, every lonely night. Marcus was my joy. He was also my purpose. That's why, when I first heard he was getting married, I cried harder than I thought I would. Not sad tears, though, maybe a little, but mostly tears of pride. My baby had grown into a man who was ready to start his own family, and I had survived long enough to see it. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a blur. Marcus and his fiancée, Rebecca, came from 2 very different worlds. She was raised in Connecticut, in a house so large that the first time I visited, I got lost looking for the bathroom. Her family was the type that hosted charity galas and golf outings. They had a polished way of speaking, like every word had been measured before leaving their mouths. I often felt like an outsider in their presence, though Marcus tried to bridge the gap. "Mom, don't worry about it," he'd tell me whenever I mentioned feeling out of place. "They love you. They respect everything you've done for me." I wanted to believe him. But there were moments like when Rebecca's mother complimented my dedication in a tone that felt more like pity, or when her father asked Marcus, in front of me, if I'd be comfortable in such a formal setting. Those words sat in my chest like stones. Still, I bit my tongue. This was Marcus's day, not mine. When the morning of the wedding arrived, I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual. I had saved for months to buy my dress, a navy blue gown that fit my figure without being too flashy. I had even gotten my hair professionally styled, something I hadn't done since Marcus's high school graduation. For once, I wanted to feel like I belonged in the photographs that would live forever. The church was breathtaking: high ceilings, stained glass catching the sunlight, and reds and blues that painted across the pews. As I walked inside, clutching my small purse, I saw guests turning, whispering, smiling politely. I held my head high, reminding myself I wasn't just anyone, I was the mother of the groom. That's why what happened next cut so deep. When I reached the reception hall later that evening, one of the event coordinators, a young man with a clipboard, guided me through the decorated room. The tables sparkled with white linens, tall arrangements of roses, and flickering candles. Each table had a neat little card with names printed in gold script. I scanned for mine, expecting to find it near the front, close to Marcus and Rebecca. Instead, the coordinator led me toward the far back corner, near the swinging doors that waiters used to slip in and out with trays of food. My table was small, tucked behind a partition, and already occupied by 3 of the catering staff, who looked as surprised to see me as I was to see them. "Table 13, Miss Johnson," the coordinator said briskly, as if nothing were unusual. I blinked. "I think there's been a mistake. I'm the groom's mother." He glanced down at his clipboard, then back at me with a tight smile. "This is where you're listed." My stomach twisted. Behind him, laughter bubbled from the main hall, where the bridal party and close family were seated under a canopy of twinkling lights. I could see Rebecca's parents right at the front, her mother in a glittering gown, her father already holding a glass of champagne. My son was smiling beside them, greeting guests. And me? I was shoved in the shadows, seated with the staff like an afterthought. I forced a smile as I sat down, though my chest burned with humiliation. One of the waitresses leaned toward me, her voice soft. "I don't think this is right, ma'am. You shouldn't be back here." Her kindness nearly undid me. I pressed my napkin to my lap, holding myself together by sheer willpower. All I could think was, after everything I've done, this is where I end up. Throughout dinner, I tried to hide my shaking hands. Every time Marcus glanced in my direction, I waved and smiled as if nothing were wrong. He didn't notice the distance, or maybe he was too caught up in the whirlwind to see. But other guests did. I caught the curious glances, the whispers. Some looked away quickly, embarrassed on my behalf. As the night wore on, the ache in my chest turned into something sharper, something like resolve. Maybe it was the sting of being humiliated in front of strangers. Maybe it was the years of swallowing words and burying feelings. But as the clinking of glasses signaled it was time for toasts, something inside me snapped into focus. I couldn't sit quietly anymore. When Rebecca's father finished his polished speech about love and legacy, and the room erupted into applause, I felt my hand tightening around my glass. My legs carried me up before I even realized what I was doing. The microphone was still warm when I took it. A hush fell over the room as I stood there, my dress catching the light, my heart pounding so loud I thought it might drown out my voice. All eyes turned to me, the woman they had hidden at the back, now standing at the front where I belonged. I lifted my glass. "My name is Angela," I began, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. "I'm Marcus's mother," and for the first time that night, people really looked at me. The silence that followed my introduction was heavier than any sound. For a heartbeat, I thought my voice might crack, but something inside me held steady. I wasn't just speaking for myself anymore, I was speaking for every sacrifice that had brought me to this moment. "I want to tell you a story," I said, my fingers tightening around the stem of the glass. "Not about the bride and groom, though this is their day, but about how we got here. About what it took for my son to stand where he is today." I saw Marcus's face in the crowd. At first, there was confusion, then concern. He hadn't expected me to speak. But I also saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes, like he knew what was coming wasn't just small talk. "When Marcus was 5 years old," I began, "I worked 3 jobs. One in the mornings, one in the evenings, and one overnight. I used to walk him to school before the sun came up, then run across town to scrub bathrooms so other people could start their day in offices that smelled like lemon polish and fresh coffee. At night, I carried trays heavier than my arms should have been able to hold, just so he could have a new backpack or a pair of sneakers that fit." Murmurs rippled through the room. Rebecca's parents shifted uncomfortably, as though my words were peeling back a curtain they preferred to keep closed. "There were times," I continued, my throat tight, "when I went without dinner so he could eat. When I wore the same coat for years while I saved for his school trips. And I didn't do it for recognition. I didn't do it to be thanked. I did it because I am his mother. And that's what love looks like when you don't have much else to give." I heard a chair scrape against the floor, someone adjusting nervously. But no one interrupted. "But today," I said, pausing to steady my voice, "I walked into this beautiful celebration, this day I dreamed about for my son, and I was seated in the back, with the staff." Gasps broke the quiet. Someone whispered, "That can't be right." Others turned toward the front tables, searching for answers in Rebecca's family's faces. I swallowed hard, my gaze sweeping the room. I don't blame the staff, they work hard, just like I have my whole life. But being placed there sent a message that I don't belong here, that my role in my son's life is less important than appearances. I could feel my hands trembling, but my words only grew clearer. "I may not have the money, I may not have the pedigree, but what I do have is a lifetime of love for that man standing there." I pointed gently toward Marcus, who now looked stricken, his mouth slightly open. "Every success he has is built on the foundation of a mother who refused to give up on him." For a moment, the room was completely still. Then, softly, applause began, hesitant at first, then stronger. It wasn't everyone. Some clapped half-heartedly, others didn't at all. but enough hands came together that the sound filled the hall. I lowered my glass, set the microphone down, and returned to my seat in the shadows. My legs felt heavy, but my heart felt lighter than it had in years. The rest of the reception unfolded in a haze. People whispered, cast sidelong glances at me. Some even approached with gentle smiles or quick hugs. Rebecca's parents avoided me, their stiff expressions betraying embarrassment. Marcus tried to come toward me once, but he was pulled back for photos, speeches, and dances. I sat quietly, letting the night move around me, but the shame that had burned in my chest earlier was gone. I had spoken my truth, and for once, everyone had heard it. Later, when the hall emptied and the music dimmed, Marcus finally found me. He was still in his tuxedo, tie loosened, his face flushed with emotion. "Mom," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you say something sooner?" I looked at him, my son, the man I had raised, and saw not just the groom of the night, but the little boy I had carried through so many storms. "Marcus, tonight wasn't the time to argue about seating charts, but I couldn't let them erase me from your story." His eyes filled with tears. "I didn't know they put you back there. I swear, Mom, if I had, I touched his arm, stopping him. "I know, but you need to understand something. Respect isn't just about what people say when they look at you, it's about how they treat the people who made you who you are." He swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "You're right, and I won't forget this." The days after the wedding were complicated. Word spread quickly among family and friends. Some praised me for my courage, others whispered that I had embarrassed Marcus on his big day. Social media lit up with photos and clips. Someone had recorded my toast, and it had already been shared dozens of times. I didn't care about the gossip. What mattered was Marcus. He came to see me 2 days later, holding a small box in his hands. "Mom," he said as he sat on my worn couch, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about everything you did for me, and I realized I never gave you what you deserved." He opened the box to reveal a delicate silver bracelet, engraved with the words, "For every sacrifice, every step, every ounce of love." Tears blurred my vision as he fastened it around my wrist. "This is just a start," he said, "but I promise you, Mom, I'll never let anyone treat you like you don't belong again. Not in my life, not in my family." I couldn't speak at first. The weight of his words pressed against the years of silence I had carried. Finally, I whispered, "That's all I ever wanted, Marcus. For you to see me, to remember." Rebecca came by later that week too. Her visit surprised me. She sat across from me in my small kitchen, looking uncomfortable but determined. "I owe you an apology," she began, her voice soft. "I should have checked the seating arrangements. I should have made sure you were at the head table, where you belonged." I studied her carefully. She wasn't polished now, not in her designer dress or with perfect hair. She was just a young woman who had married my son, nervously twisting her engagement ring. "You can't change what happened," I said gently, "but you can choose how you move forward. If you love Marcus, then love the woman who raised him too. Not out of pity, not out of duty, but out of respect." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "I do, and I will." It wasn't a perfect resolution. It didn't erase the sting of that night. But it was a start. Looking back now, I realized the toast wasn't just about reclaiming my place at my son's wedding. It was about reclaiming my place in his life. I had spent so many years fading into the background, carrying the weight silently, thinking love was enough without recognition. But love also needs light. It needs space to be seen. That night, in front of everyone, I gave my love a voice. And though the words were hard, they opened a door I didn't even know was closed. For the first time in a long time, I felt not just like Marcus's mother but like myself again. The week after the wedding, life returned to a fragile kind of normal. I went back to my routine: early mornings with coffee in my chipped mug, afternoons working part-time at the community center, evenings alone in my quiet apartment. But nothing really felt the same. Something had shifted inside me. Something I couldn't put back where it had been. The toast was still echoing through people's conversations. At the grocery store, an old neighbor stopped me. "Angela, I saw the video," she said, her hand brushing my arm. "You spoke with such honesty." I cried watching it. I wasn't used to being noticed. let alone praised. For most of my life, I had blended into the background, letting others shine. Now, suddenly, I was visible, and while it was uncomfortable, it also felt validating. Marcus called every day that week, sometimes just for a minute, sometimes longer. He asked about my health, what I had eaten, even if I was sleeping enough. At first, I laughed and told him he didn't need to check up on me like I was a child. But deep down, I cherished every call. It reminded me that he saw me now not just as his mother, but as a woman who had carried him through fire. On Thursday evening, he invited me to dinner at his and Rebecca's new apartment in Manhattan. When I arrived, Rebecca greeted me at the door. She wore jeans and a simple blouse, her hair pulled back in a ponytail so different from the glamorous bride I had seen on her wedding day. She smiled nervously. "Angela, I'm glad you came." I stepped inside, my eyes scanning the space. It was elegant, but not overwhelming. Large windows, clean lines, a faint scent of fresh flowers. Marcus came from the kitchen, apron still tied around his waist, grinning like a boy. "Mom, you made it!" He hugged me tightly, the kind of hug that squeezes away the years of distance. Dinner was simple: roasted chicken, vegetables, salad. Nothing fancy, but everything seasoned with care. We sat at their dining table, laughter filling the air as Marcus told stories from our old neighborhood, making Rebecca laugh until tears streamed down her face. For the first time, I felt like I belonged in their world. After dinner, Marcus grew quiet. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on me. "Mom," he said softly, "there's something I need to ask you." My heart skipped. "What is it?" He hesitated, glancing at Rebecca, then back at me. "Would you move in with us?" "Not forever. Just for a while. We've been talking, and we both think maybe it's time you didn't have to carry everything alone." I froze. For years, independence had been my armor. My small apartment, my bills, my routines, they were proof that I could survive on my own. But now, my son was asking me to step into his new life, to share space not as a burden, but as family. Rebecca reached across the table, her voice gentle. "We want you close, Angela. Not out of pity, but because you matter to us. To both of us." Tears pricked my eyes. I shook my head slowly. "I don't want to interfere. This is your marriage, your new chapter. You don't need me hovering." Marcus leaned forward. "You'll never be an interference. You're the reason I'm even standing here. You deserve to share in this chapter too." His words wrapped around me like a blanket. Still, I needed time to think. "Let me sit with it," I whispered. They both nodded, giving me the space I needed. That night, back in my apartment, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak of old pipes, familiar sounds that had once comforted me now felt like reminders of solitude. I thought about all the years I had poured myself into Marcus, only to prepare him for a life that might not have room for me. But maybe I had been wrong. Maybe this was the moment when the circle closed, when all the giving finally came back. For the first time in a long while, the idea of not being alone didn't scare me. 2 days later, I was at the community center when a woman approached me. She was younger, maybe late 20s, with tired eyes and a baby balanced on her hip. "Excuse me," she said shyly. "Are you the woman from the wedding video? The one who gave that speech?" I blinked in surprise. Yes, that was me. Her face lit up. "I just wanted to say thank you. I watched it online, and it made me feel less invisible. I'm a single mom too. Sometimes it feels like nobody notices the sacrifices. But hearing you, it gave me hope." I didn't know what to say at first. My throat tightened as I reached out to touch her arm. "You're not invisible. Don't ever forget that." She smiled, tears welling up, and for the first time, I realized my words had gone beyond that wedding hall. They had touched people I didn't even know. That evening, Marcus called again. "Mom," he said, "Rebecca and I were thinking, what if we host a family dinner? Everyone. My aunts, cousins, Rebecca's parents too. And this time, you sit at the head of the table, where you belong." The idea both thrilled and terrified me. Facing Rebecca's parents again wouldn't be easy. But maybe this was the chance to reclaim my dignity, not just for myself, but for every mother who had ever been pushed aside. I agreed. The following week, I found myself walking into Marcus and Rebecca's apartment once more. The dining table was set for 12, candles glowing softly. Family members filled the space with chatter and laughter. When Rebecca's parents arrived, the room shifted. Her mother's smile was polite but strained, her father's handshake stiff. I could feel the tension, but I stood tall, wearing a dress that made me feel strong. Marcus clinked his glass. Before we eat, I want to say something. The room fell quiet. He looked around, his voice firm. At our wedding, something happened that should never have happened. My mother, the woman who gave me everything, wasn't given the respect she deserved. But tonight, I want to make it right. He walked to my chair, pulled it gently forward, and placed me at the head of the table. This is where she belongs. The room erupted in applause. Even Rebecca's parents joined in, albeit more reservedly. But for once, I didn't care about their hesitation. I cared about the warmth in the room, the recognition in my son's eyes, the way Rebecca smiled with genuine pride. As dinner unfolded, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not just love, but belonging. Later that night, as I hugged Marcus goodbye, he whispered in my ear, "Mom, this is just the beginning. I promise." For the first time in decades, I believed him. When I woke up the next morning, the sun was streaming through my thin curtains, casting pale golden lines across the worn carpet. I lay there for a long while, staring at the ceiling, replaying the dinner at Marcus's apartment. His words, "This is where she belongs," echoed through me, softening years of scars I had carried silently. But as much as that dinner had felt like a turning point, I also knew life had a way of testing new beginnings, and I wasn't naive enough to believe everything would fall neatly into place. That afternoon, as I was folding laundry, my phone buzzed. It was Marcus. "Mom," he said quickly, "Rebecca's parents want to meet with you. Just the three of you. They asked me to set it up." My stomach tightened. "Why?" "They didn't say exactly," Marcus admitted, "but I think they want to clear the air. Look, I know it's awkward, but maybe it's a chance to finally settle things." I sighed, pressing the phone to my ear. "And if it's not? What if it's another way of reminding me I don't belong?" Marcus's voice softened. "Then you tell them the same way you told everyone at the wedding. You speak your truth." "But Mom, please, for me, give them a chance." I agreed, though uneasily. 2 days later, I found myself walking into a cafe in downtown Manhattan. The place was upscale, polished wood tables, brass fixtures, waiters gliding silently in crisp uniforms. Rebecca's parents were already seated at a corner table. Her mother, Evelyn, looked immaculate in a cream-colored suit. Her father, Charles, sat stiffly in a navy blazer, his expression guarded. "Angela," Evelyn said, standing briefly to offer a polite kiss on the cheek. "Thank you for coming." I nodded, taking my seat. My hands rested in my lap, steadying myself. Charles cleared his throat. "We wanted to speak with you privately because, well, we realized the way things unfolded at the wedding wasn't acceptable." My brows arched slightly. "You realize?" He shifted uncomfortably. "It wasn't intentional. The seating arrangement was an oversight. The planners must have misunderstood." I held his gaze. "An oversight that placed me behind a partition with strangers at my own son's wedding." Silence stretched between us. Evelyn spoke next, her tone softer. "We understand how painful that must have been, and we're sorry, truly, but we also wanted to get to know you better, without the noise, without the tension." I studied her carefully. For the first time, her voice didn't carry that faint edge of pity. She sounded sincere. So I leaned back in my chair and said, "All right, ask me anything." The questions started carefully. Evelyn asked about my work at the community center, my hobbies, even my favorite books. Charles asked about Marcus's childhood, though his tone was more formal, like he was interviewing me. I answered each honestly, not embellishing, not minimizing. I told them about the long nights cleaning offices, about the little games Marcus and I played to make empty refrigerators feel less frightening. I spoke about the pride of watching him graduate, and the loneliness that followed when he moved out. At some point, Evelyn's eyes grew misty. "I had no idea," she whispered. I gave a small smile. "That's because you never asked. Charles looked down at his coffee, silent. When the conversation finally wound down, Evelyn reached across the table, her hand brushing mine. Angela, I can't erase the hurt, but I want you to know, from this point on, you're part of our family, and I intend to treat you that way. I studied her hand on mine, the warmth in her eyes. Slowly, I nodded. I'll hold you to that. Walking out of the cafe, I felt a strange mixture of relief and caution. Words were easy, following through was harder. But maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something new. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of my life shifted again. Marcus and Rebecca visited often, sometimes with groceries, sometimes just for coffee. Evelyn called once to invite me to a charity event, something I politely declined, but the gesture meant more than she knew. And then, one evening, Marcus appeared at my door with a surprising announcement. "Mom," he said, excitement lighting his face. "Rebecca and I are expecting." The words hit me like a wave. My hand flew to my mouth. "You mean I'm going to be a grandmother?" Marcus grinned, nodding. "Yes, you are." Tears spilled before I could stop them. I pulled him into my arms, my voice trembling. "Oh, Marcus, that's the best news I've ever heard." The months that followed were filled with preparations. Rebecca softened toward me, inviting me to doctor appointments, asking for advice on baby clothes, even calling late at night with questions about her changing body. For the first time, I felt not like an outsider, but like a guide. One evening, as I folded tiny onesies in their nursery, Rebecca said quietly, "Angela, I want you there when the baby's born. Not just in the waiting room, in the delivery room with me." I froze, the fabric soft in my hands. "Are you sure? That's a very intimate moment." She nodded firmly. "I'm sure. You've been through it. You know what it's like. And I want your strength there." Emotion swelled in my chest. I reached out, squeezing her hand. "Then I'll be there." When the baby finally arrived, a little girl with a full head of dark curls and lungs that filled the room, I held her in my arms and felt something I hadn't felt in decades. A new beginning. Her tiny fingers curled around mine, and I whispered, "You'll never know what it's like to be invisible." Not with me around, Marcus stood beside me, his eyes shining with tears. "Mom," he whispered, "you're the heart of this family." And for once, I believed it. But even as joy filled my days, I couldn't forget the humiliation I had endured at the wedding. It wasn't bitterness, it was memory. A reminder of how quickly people could dismiss you, how fragile dignity could be when others decided your worth. That's why I started writing. Late at night, after the baby was asleep and the apartment was quiet, I began putting my story on paper. Not just for me, but for her, for my granddaughter. I wanted her to know that her family wasn't built on wealth or polished reputations. It was built on resilience, sacrifice, and love that refused to be silenced. By the time the baby turned 3 months, I had filled an entire notebook. I didn't know if I'd ever publish it, or if it would sit quietly in a drawer. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that my story was no longer hidden. And when I looked at that little girl in her crib, her chest rising and falling with each breath, I knew one thing for certain. The legacy I had built wouldn't be erased. Not by a seating chart, not by whispers, not by anyone. Because now, finally, I had found my place. The months after my granddaughter's birth were some of the sweetest of my life. I had never imagined myself cradling a baby again, let alone one who carried pieces of both Marcus and me in her tiny features. Every time she smiled, my heart swelled with a kind of joy I hadn't felt in decades. But along with that joy came responsibility. I had promised myself she would never feel invisible, never doubt her worth. And that promise meant confronting not just the past, but the way our family moved forward. One afternoon, while Rebecca rested, I rocked the baby in the living room. The apartment was filled with sunlight, the city noise muted by thick glass windows. Marcus sat across from me, his elbows on his knees, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Mom," he said finally, "have you ever thought about what you want for yourself? I mean, beyond me, beyond the baby." The question startled me. For so long, my life had revolved around others, keeping Marcus fed, clothed, educated, supported. Now, with him grown and building his own family, The space for me to even consider what I wanted felt foreign. I looked down at the baby in my arms, her little fingers curling in her sleep. I don't know, I admitted. I've been surviving so long, I never stopped to think about what comes after. Marcus leaned forward, his voice gentle. You don't have to just survive anymore. You deserve more than that. The words stayed with me long after he left the room. That evening, I pulled out the notebook I had been filling with my story. I read through the pages slowly, seeing my own handwriting tell the story of struggle, sacrifice, and love. For the first time, I wondered if maybe it wasn't just for my granddaughter. Maybe other women, other mothers needed to hear it too. The idea scared me. Who would want to read about a woman like me? A janitor, a waitress, a mother who had been humiliated at her own son's wedding. But another voice inside whispered, maybe more people than you think. A week later, Rebecca invited me to join her and Evelyn, her mother, at a small charity luncheon. I hesitated, but she insisted. It's casual, she promised, and I want you there. It's important. When I arrived, the room was filled with women in elegant dresses, their conversations laced with laughter and polished ease. I felt out of place immediately, but Rebecca stayed close to my side, introducing me with warmth. At one point, Evelyn stood at the podium to speak. She talked about the importance of women supporting each other, of recognizing sacrifices made in silence. And then, to my shock, she gestured toward me. Angela, she said, her voice carrying through the room, taught me something important. That resilience doesn't always come from privilege. Sometimes it comes from struggle, and it deserves to be honored. All eyes turned to me. My chest tightened, but instead of shrinking, I lifted my chin. For the first time in that kind of space, I didn't feel invisible. After the luncheon, several women approached me, asking questions, offering kind words. One of them, a publisher, slipped me her card. If you've ever thought about writing, she said, I'd love to hear your story. I tucked the card into my purse, my mind buzzing. Later that night, I sat in my apartment staring at the card. My heart raced at the thought. Could I really put my story into the world? Could I risk being vulnerable all over again? I thought about the single mother at the community center who had thanked me for my speech. I thought about the women at the luncheon, nodding with recognition. And I thought about my granddaughter, who one day might need a story to remind her that strength comes in many forms. I picked up my pen and began writing again, this time with purpose. As weeks turned into months, my notebook grew heavier. Marcus and Rebecca noticed my late nights at the kitchen table, and Marcus finally asked, Mom, what are you working on? I hesitated, then handed him the notebook. He read silently for a long time, his brow furrowed, his lips pressed tight. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet. Mom, he said, his voice breaking, this is incredible. People need to hear this. I shook my head. It's just my life, Marcus. Nothing special. He set the notebook down firmly. It's everything special. You don't see it because you lived it. But Mom, this isn't just a story, it's a testimony. Rebecca, who had been listening quietly, leaned forward. Angela, you could help so many women by sharing this. And if you want, I'll help you every step of the way. Their encouragement lit a spark I hadn't known was there. I reached out to the publisher whose card I had kept. To my surprise, she responded quickly, asking to meet. At our meeting, she listened intently as I described my life, my struggles, my toast at the wedding. She leafed through my notebook, her eyes widening. Angela, she said finally, this isn't just a book. This is a movement. Your story could change lives. I left the meeting dazed, clutching her enthusiastic notes. For the first time, I saw myself not just as a survivor, but as a storyteller. But not everyone was ready to embrace this new chapter. One Sunday dinner, when Marcus announced I was writing a book, Charles, Rebecca's father, frowned. Angela, are you sure that's wise? Airing personal details in public? I met his gaze steadily. For years, I stayed silent. And where did that get me? Sitting at a back table at my own son's wedding. If my story makes even one woman stand taller, it's worth every risk. The room went quiet. Rebecca reached for my hand, squeezing it. Marcus smiled proudly. Charles said nothing more. The baby grew quickly, filling the apartment with giggles and cries. I spent hours rocking her, humming lullabies, imagining the world she would grow up in. I wanted that world to be kinder, more aware, less dismissive of women like me. And maybe, just maybe, my book could be part of that change. By the time my granddaughter's first birthday arrived, the manuscript was finished. It wasn't polished yet, but it was whole. Marcus threw a party at the apartment, balloons, cake, family gathered close. At one point, Evelyn raised her glass, turning to me. To Angela, she said warmly, a woman who taught us all what resilience looks like. The room erupted in cheers. My cheeks flushed, but this time, it wasn't humiliation I felt. It was pride. As I held my granddaughter in my arms, her tiny hands clutching at my necklace, I whispered to her, "You'll know my story one day, and you'll know you come from strength." And for the first time, I didn't just feel like I belonged. I felt like I was building something bigger than myself. The manuscript sat on my kitchen table like a living thing. Every page felt heavy with the weight of memory, my struggles, my sacrifices, my humiliations, and the love that had kept me moving through all of it. For weeks I had been revising, scratching out sentences, rewriting paragraphs, reliving moments I thought I had buried forever. And then came the day the publisher called. "Angela," she said, her voice bright with excitement, "we've reviewed your manuscript. We want to move forward. If you're ready, your book could be on shelves within a year." I sat there in stunned silence, my pen still in hand. A year? Me, a published author? It didn't seem real. When I told Marcus and Rebecca, their reaction nearly brought me to tears. "Mom," Marcus exclaimed, lifting me off the ground in a hug like he was a boy again. "Do you know how proud I am of you?" Rebecca smiled, her eyes shining. "This is going to inspire so many women." "I know it," even Evelyn, when she heard the news, called to congratulate me. "Angela," she said, her tone genuine, "I hope you know how much courage it takes to put your story into the world. You have my full support." It was a far cry from the woman who had once looked at me like I was out of place. But with the excitement came fear. At night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what people would say when they read about my struggles. Would they see me as strong, or would they look down on me for the years I had spent cleaning toilets and serving food? I shared these fears with Marcus one evening while I fed the baby mashed carrots in their kitchen. He shook his head firmly. "Mom, you've always worried about how people see you. But the truth is, you've already proven yourself. You raised me. You stood up for yourself at my wedding. You wrote this book. If people can't see your worth after all that, that's their problem." His words sank deep. For once, I allowed myself to believe them. The months that followed were a whirlwind. The publisher connected me with an editor who worked closely with me, shaping my words into something sharper, more powerful. We chose a title that made my chest tighten with pride, The Back Table. It was simple, but it carried everything: the pain of being pushed aside, the courage of standing up, and the strength of reclaiming my place. The first time I held the advance copy in my hands, I cried. The cover was beautiful, bold letters against a simple background, a single glass raised in a toast. My name underneath. My name. The release date approached quickly. The publisher scheduled a small launch event at a bookstore in Manhattan. I tried to tell myself no one would come, that it would just be Marcus, Rebecca, and maybe a few friends. But when I walked in that evening, my knees nearly buckled. The room was packed. Rows of chairs filled with strangers, women of all ages, men too. Cameras flashed. People whispered my name. Rebecca squeezed my hand. "This is all for you." The event host introduced me, and when I stepped onto the small stage, the applause was thunderous. I stood behind the podium, heart pounding, the same way it had at the wedding when I first picked up the microphone. "Good evening," I began. "My name is Angela Johnson. Some of you may know me as the woman who gave a toast that went viral. But tonight, I want you to know me as something else. A mother, a survivor, and now, a writer." I read an excerpt from my book, the chapter about working overnight shifts, sneaking home in time to make Marcus breakfast, then collapsing into bed while the rest of the world went about their day. My voice trembled, but I didn't stop. By the time I closed the book, I saw tears in the eyes of people in the audience. When the applause came again, it felt like a wave, washing over me, lifting me higher than I had ever stood. After the reading, women lined up to meet me. Some hugged me, some cried, others pressed my hands as they whispered, "Thank you." I saw myself in your story. One woman, older than me, leaned close and said, "I've been invisible my whole life. Tonight, you made me feel seen." Her words stayed with me long after the event ended. The following weeks were a blur of interviews, articles, even a television appearance. My story resonated far beyond what I had ever imagined. But with the recognition came something else, a responsibility. I wasn't just Angela, the mother who had been humiliated at her son's wedding. I was Angela, the woman who had turned pain into power, who was now being asked to speak on behalf of mothers, of working women, of those who had been overlooked. At times, the weight of it scared me. But then I would look at my granddaughter, her wide eyes, her giggles, her tiny hand clutching mine, and I knew why I had to keep going. One evening, after a long day of interviews, I sat with Marcus on his balcony, the city lights flickering below us. "Do you ever think," I asked, "that all of this happened because of one moment? Because I refused to stay quiet at that wedding?" Marcus nodded slowly. "Yeah, but Mom, it wasn't just that moment. It was every moment before it. Every sacrifice, every choice, every time you picked yourself up and kept going. The wedding toast was just the spark, but you were the fire all along." His words brought tears to my eyes. I reached over and held his hand, feeling the warmth of my son's love, the man he had become because I never gave up. Still, not everyone celebrated my success. Charles remained skeptical, sometimes making quiet comments about airing dirty laundry, but I no longer let his words cut me. For once, I had found my voice, and I wasn't about to silence it for anyone. Even Evelyn, who had once been my harshest critic, defended me at a dinner party when someone dismissed my story as just another memoir. She lifted her chin and said firmly, "Angela's story matters because it's real, and it's changed lives, including mine." Hearing her say that nearly undid me. The book climbed bestseller lists faster than I could process. Invitations poured in for speaking engagements. I traveled to community centers, schools, conferences, standing in front of women who reminded me of myself, telling them, "You're not invisible. Your story matters." Every time I spoke, I felt the same fire I had felt with the microphone at the wedding. A fire that came not from anger anymore, but from purpose. And yet, no matter how far I traveled or how many people I met, I always came back to one place, Marcus's home, where my granddaughter's laughter filled the rooms. One night, as I tucked her into bed, I whispered, "One day, you'll read my book. You'll know everything I went through, and you'll know you were worth every moment of it. Even before you were born." She cooed softly in her sleep, her tiny chest rising and falling. And in that quiet, I realized something I hadn't before. The book, the speeches, the recognition, they were all important. But my true legacy wasn't in the pages or the applause. It was in the generations I had fought for, in the family I had rebuilt from ashes. And for the first time in my life, I felt not just seen, but whole. Success changes things, sometimes in ways you expect, sometimes in ways you don't. After The Back Table became a bestseller, people began treating me differently. Neighbors who had barely said hello now stopped me in the hallway to congratulate me. Former co-workers from the diner sent me messages on Facebook, some asking if I remembered them, others telling me they always knew I had something special in me. It was flattering, yes, but also strange. For so long, I had lived in the shadows, my work unnoticed, my sacrifices unspoken. Now, suddenly, people wanted pieces of me. And while part of me enjoyed the recognition, another part clung tightly to my privacy, my quiet life. At the same time, my relationship with Marcus deepened. He called me not just to check in, but to really talk about his struggles, his dreams, his fears as a new father. One night, while the baby slept, we sat at the kitchen table, coffee mugs in hand. "Mom," he said softly, "when I was younger, I didn't always understand what you were carrying. I thought you were just being strict, or tired, or busy. But now that I'm a parent, I get it. You carried the world for me. Tears blurred my vision, and I reached across the table, squeezing his hand. I carried it because I had to, but also because I wanted to. You were my reason to keep going. He smiled, eyes wet. Now I want to be that for my daughter, and I want her to know exactly where her strength comes from. Not everyone was as open-hearted. Charles, despite his wife's warming attitude, remained distant. At a family gathering one Sunday, he made another pointed comment. I just hope all this publicity doesn't go to your head, Angela, he said as we cleared the dishes. Fame can be fleeting. I paused, setting down a stack of plates. I looked him directly in the eyes and replied, respect shouldn't be fleeting. And that's all I've ever wanted. Not fame, respect. The room went quiet. Evelyn shot her husband a sharp glance, and for once, he said nothing more. Meanwhile, Rebecca surprised me in the most unexpected way. One afternoon, she pulled me aside while Marcus played with the baby in the living room. Angela, she said, her voice quiet but steady, I need to thank you. You've taught me more in the past year than I learned in all my years growing up in privilege. You showed me that love isn't about money or appearances. It's about sacrifice and truth. And I promise I'll raise my daughter with those values. The ones you gave Marcus. Emotion swelled in my chest. I pulled her into a hug, whispering, that means more to me than you'll ever know. The book tour expanded, and I traveled more than I ever dreamed I would. From small towns in the South to crowded auditoriums in Los Angeles, I stood before audiences and told my story. Each time, I saw nodding heads, tear-filled eyes, and women lining up afterward to tell me their own stories of invisibility, of strength, of survival. One night, after a particularly moving event in Chicago, a young woman approached me. She looked exhausted, her clothes worn, a baby carrier slung over her shoulder. Miss Johnson, she said, her voice trembling, I almost didn't come tonight. I didn't have the money for a ticket, but someone gave me one, and I'm glad they did, because I thought I was alone. But hearing you, I know now I'm not. I hugged her tightly, whispering, you're never alone. Don't let anyone make you believe otherwise. Moments like that reminded me why I had chosen to tell my story. Back in New York, though, life was still complicated. With success came attention, and not all of it was kind. Online, I read comments from strangers calling me bitter, saying I had embarrassed my son on his wedding day, accusing me of using victimhood to gain sympathy. At first, the words cut deep. I lay awake at night, scrolling through them, my chest tightening. But one evening, Marcus found me reading them and gently took the phone from my hand. Mom, he said firmly, these people don't know you. They don't know what you went through. Stop giving them your time. Look at me. Look at Rebecca. Look at your granddaughter. We know who you are. That's what matters. I nodded, tears spilling down my cheeks. And slowly, I began to believe him. The turning point came during a major speaking engagement in Washington, D.C. The auditorium was filled with policymakers, activists, and educators. I stood on stage, the lights blinding, the audience silent. I began the way I always did, with the story of being seated at the back table at my son's wedding. But then I added something I hadn't said before. I wasn't humiliated that night because of a mistake on a seating chart. I was humiliated because society has a way of telling women like me, working class, single mothers, that we don't belong at the front, that we should stay quiet and seen. But I stood up, and in standing up, I found not just my voice, but a movement. The applause was deafening. Afterward, a senator approached me backstage. Ms. Johnson, she said, shaking my hand, your story needs to be heard in places like Congress. Will you come speak to us? My knees nearly buckled. Me? Speaking in Congress? But I found myself saying yes. That night, back in my hotel room, I called Marcus. Mom, he exclaimed when I told him, do you realize what this means? You're not just telling your story anymore. You're changing things. I laughed softly, still in disbelief. I'm just trying to make sure no other mother feels invisible. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I was fighting for dignity, not just mine, but for women everywhere who had ever been pushed to the back. Still, Even with all the recognition, my happiest moments remain the simplest ones, rocking my granddaughter to sleep, sharing meals with Marcus and Rebecca, walking through the park with Evelyn, who had become, against all odds, something like a friend. One evening, as I held my granddaughter close, I whispered into her tiny ear, "One day, you'll know everything I went through. And you'll know that you, little one, are the reason I never gave up. Because I wanted you to grow up in a world that sees women like me." She stirred softly in her sleep, her tiny hand brushing against my chest. And in that quiet moment, I knew, no matter how far my voice reached, my truest legacy was in the love I passed down. When the invitation came from Washington, I almost didn't believe it was real. A neatly typed letter, embossed with the seal of the United States Senate, sat in my trembling hands. They wanted me, Angela Johnson, to testify before a congressional committee about the challenges faced by single mothers in America. I read the letter 3 times, the words blurring with disbelief. Me? A woman who had once scrubbed toilets just to buy her son school supplies? And now I was being asked to speak to lawmakers? The weight of it sank in slowly. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about every mother who had worked herself to the bone, every woman who had been dismissed, every person told to sit at the back. Marcus's reaction was immediate. "Mom, this is incredible," he said, pacing the living room with the baby perched on his hip. "Do you know how many people dream of having this chance? You have to do it." Rebecca hugged me tightly. "You'll be amazing. Just speak the way you always do, honest and real," even Evelyn called, her voice full of pride. "Angela, you're carrying the stories of so many women with you. Don't underestimate how powerful that is." Charles remained silent, of course, but by then his opinion no longer held the same weight it once had. The weeks leading up to the hearing were a blur of preparation. The publisher connected me with an advocacy group that helped me shape my testimony. We worked late into the night, turning my story into something that could not just touch hearts but influence policy. I practiced in front of Marcus and Rebecca, my voice trembling at first, then growing steadier. My granddaughter sat in her high chair, clapping her tiny hands when I finished, as if even she understood the importance. The day of the hearing arrived. I wore a navy suit, simple but strong, with the bracelet Marcus had given me gleaming on my wrist. As I walked into the grand chamber, the weight of history pressed down on me, the high ceilings, the marble columns, the rows of suited officials waiting to hear my words. When my name was called, I sat at the long table, a microphone before me, cameras flashing from every angle. My hands shook slightly, but I took a deep breath and began. "My name is Angela Johnson," I said. "I am a mother, a worker, and the author of The Back Table. But before all that, I was a woman who spent 2 decades working multiple jobs, raising a son on my own, and often feeling invisible in a society that measures worth by wealth. I spoke of sleepless nights, of choosing between bills and groceries, of sitting at the back of the wedding hall when I should have been at the front. I told them how that moment had forced me to speak not just for myself, but for everyone who had ever been pushed aside. And then I looked each senator in the eye and said, if you want to understand the strength of this country, look at its mothers, the ones holding it together in silence, the ones who deserve not pity, but respect. When I finished, the room was silent. Then, slowly, applause rose not just from the audience, but from some of the senators themselves. Afterward, reporters swarmed me, microphones shoved toward my face, questions shouted over one another. "Angela, what message do you hope Congress takes away from your testimony?" I paused, choosing my words carefully. That mothers are not invisible, that dignity is not a luxury, and that no one should ever be made to sit at the back table in life. The clip aired that night on national television. I watched from Marcus's couch, my granddaughter asleep in my arms, tears streaming down my face as I saw myself on the screen, not as the woman who had once been humiliated, but as a woman whose voice could no longer be silenced. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. My testimony sparked conversations across the country. Newspapers ran editorials. Advocacy groups quoted my words. Strangers sent letters to my apartment, women sharing their own struggles, thanking me for giving them a voice. But amid the chaos, I kept my feet grounded in the simplest joys. walking with my granddaughter in the park, sharing Sunday dinners with Marcus and Rebecca, folding laundry in my little apartment, the familiar creak of the floor grounding me. Because no matter how far my story reached, I never wanted to lose the core of who I was, the mother who had done whatever it took to keep her child fed, clothed, and loved. One evening, while I rocked my granddaughter to sleep, Marcus sat beside me. "Mom," he said softly, "do you realize how far you've come? From cleaning offices to standing in Congress? From being silenced to being a voice for thousands?" I kissed the baby's forehead, my eyes misting. "Sometimes I think about that night at your wedding," I admitted. "How small I felt, how humiliated. And now, it almost feels like it was meant to happen, like it pushed me to stand up, not just for me, but for all of this." Marcus's eyes filled with pride. That toast didn't just change the wedding, it changed everything. Not long after, Evelyn invited me to lunch. We sat by the window of a quiet restaurant, sunlight streaming in. "Angela," she said, her voice unusually tender, "I want to thank you. You've changed the way I see things. Not just about you, but about myself. I've realized how often I looked past people, how much I measured worth by appearances. But watching you, you've humbled me. You've made me better." I studied her face, the sincerity in her eyes. Slowly, I nodded. "We've both learned, and that's what family should be, learning, growing, respecting." She smiled, and for the first time, I felt we truly were family. As my granddaughter grew, I began to see myself in her determination when she reached for toys, her fiery little laugh, the spark in her eyes. I knew she would grow up in a different world than I had, but I also knew the lessons of resilience and dignity would flow through her veins. One night, as I tucked her into bed, Rebecca stood in the doorway, watching quietly. "You know," she said softly, "one day she's going to read your book. She'll know everything you went through, and she'll be so proud to call you her grandmother." I brushed a curl from the baby's forehead. That's all I ever wanted, for her to know where she comes from, for her to never feel invisible. Rebecca's eyes glistened. "And she won't, because of you." Lying in bed later that night, I realized something important. My story had started in pain, humiliation, sacrifice, struggle, but it had grown into something larger than I ever imagined. And now, it wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every woman who had ever been told she didn't belong. It was about turning shame into strength, invisibility into visibility, silence into power. I closed my eyes, a smile tugging at my lips, and whispered into the quiet, "I found my place at the table, and I'll never give it up again." The morning after my testimony aired on national television, I woke to a knock at my door. When I opened it, there was a stack of envelopes on the floor, letters, dozens of them. Some were handwritten in shaky cursive, others typed neatly on crisp paper. They were from women across the country, and even a few from men, all thanking me for sharing my story. One letter in particular stayed with me. It read, "Angela, I watched your speech while rocking my baby at AM. I felt seen for the first time in years. You gave me strength to keep going. Thank you." I held that letter to my chest, tears streaming down my cheeks. It wasn't about fame or recognition anymore. It was about connection, about turning my pain into someone else's hope. Marcus stopped by later that day, baby in tow. He grinned when he saw the letters stacked on my kitchen table. "Look at this, Mom," he said, lifting one envelope and shaking his head in awe. "You're touching lives all over the country. Do you realize what you've done?" I smiled faintly. I never imagined my story would leave this little apartment, let alone reach strangers' hearts. He set the baby on my lap, her tiny fingers tugging at my blouse. "That's because you don't see yourself the way we do. To me, you've always been extraordinary. Now the rest of the world finally knows it too." As the months passed, my calendar filled with events, interviews, and speeches. I was invited to universities where young women lined up afterward, telling me they saw their own mothers in my story. I was invited to churches where entire congregations prayed over me, thanking God for my resilience. At first, it felt overwhelming. I wasn't used to so much attention. But every time I looked at my granddaughter, her eyes full of promise, her little laugh like music, I remembered why I was doing it. This wasn't about me anymore. It was about building a world where she, and girls like her, would never feel invisible. Still, there were moments of doubt. One evening, after a long speaking tour, I sat alone in my apartment, scrolling through news articles. Some headlines praised me. Angela Johnson, the voice of working mothers. Others dismissed me. From janitor to bestseller, but is she exploiting her pain? The criticism cut deeper than I wanted to admit. I shut my laptop, my hands trembling. Was I exploiting my pain? Was I turning my life into spectacle? That night, I couldn't sleep. My thoughts raced until sunrise. The next day, I visited Marcus. As soon as he saw my face, he knew something was wrong. What happened? He asked, worry creasing his brow. I hesitated, then admitted, I read some things online. People saying I'm just cashing in on my pain, that I'm making a show out of my struggles. Marcus shook his head firmly. Mom, no, you're not exploiting your pain, you're transforming it. You're showing people that dignity can grow out of struggle. Don't let critics take that away from you. Rebecca chimed in, her voice steady. Angela, the people who say that are the ones who've never had to fight like you have. They don't understand. But the women who write you letters, the ones who cry at your speeches, they understand. And they're who you're doing this for. Her words eased a knot in my chest. That weekend, Evelyn invited me to her home in Connecticut. I hesitated, memories of feeling out of place there still stung, but I agreed. When I arrived, she welcomed me warmly, guiding me to the dining room where lunch was set. As we ate, she leaned forward, her voice low. Angela, I need to tell you something. When I first met you, I didn't understand you. I saw your sacrifices as desperation, not strength. I judged you without knowing your story. And I was wrong. So wrong. Her eyes glistened as she continued. But watching you now, seeing the way you've turned your pain into purpose, I realize you are the strongest woman I've ever met. And I'm honored to call you family. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Then I whispered, thank you, Evelyn. That means more than you know. And for the first time since Marcus had met Rebecca, I truly felt accepted, not just tolerated, but embraced. Meanwhile, my granddaughter was growing fast. She had started walking, her tiny steps wobbly but determined. Watching her stumble, fall, then stand up again filled me with awe. I saw myself in her persistence. One evening, as she toddled toward me, Marcus laughed. She's got your spirit, Mom. Nothing keeps her down. I scooped her up, kissing her soft cheek. Good, I whispered. She'll need it, because I knew the world wasn't always kind to women. But I also knew she was being raised in a family that had learned, through me, to value resilience and respect. The next turning point came when a major television network invited me to host a series of talks featuring women's stories. At first, I balked at the idea. Me, a TV host? It seemed ridiculous. But Marcus encouraged me. Mom, think about it. You'll be giving other women the chance to be heard, just like you finally were. Isn't that what you've always wanted? He was right. And so, I agreed. The show, titled At the Table, premiered that fall. Each episode featured women from different walks of life: nurses, single mothers, immigrants, veterans telling their stories. And each time, I sat with them, holding their hands, looking them in the eyes, telling them, you belong here. The response was overwhelming. Viewers wrote in saying the show made them feel less alone, that it gave them courage to share their own stories. And with each episode, I felt myself healing more, the wounds of my past closing as I gave space for others to speak. But success didn't erase the memory of where it all began. One night, after filming, I sat with Marcus on his balcony. The city lights glittered below, the hum of traffic rising like distant music. Do you ever think about that night, Mom? Marcus asked softly. The wedding? How everything changed. I nodded slowly. All the time. I think about how small I felt, sitting at that back table, and how terrified I was when I picked up that microphone. But if I hadn't spoken, none of this would have happened. Marcus smiled, his eyes tender. It was the hardest night of my life, seeing you hurt like that. But it was also the night you showed the world who you really are. And I'll never stop being proud of you. Tears welled in my eyes as I whispered, thank you, son, for seeing me. As I rocked my granddaughter to sleep later that night, I thought about everything that had happened since that humiliating moment. The toast had started as an act of survival, a desperate attempt to reclaim my dignity, but it had grown into something larger, a movement, a voice, a legacy. And now, with my granddaughter nestled against my chest, I knew the journey wasn't over. There were still stories to tell, still women to uplift, still battles to fight. But I also knew this: I would never again let anyone decide where I belonged, because I had earned my place at the table, at the front, at the center of my own story. The night before my final book tour event, I sat at my small kitchen table, the same table where I had once scribbled the first words of the back table in a worn-out notebook. The city outside buzzed with life, but inside my apartment, it was quiet, just me, my memories, and the weight of the journey I had walked. I thought about that night at Marcus's wedding, when I had been humiliated in front of everyone, seated with the staff as though my life and sacrifices didn't matter. I thought about how my hands had shaken as I raised my glass, how my voice had wavered at first but then grew strong as I told my truth. That toast had cracked something open, not just in the room that night, but in me. And now, years later, I was preparing to close this chapter of my story with a speech that would reach thousands. The event was held in a packed auditorium in New York City. Marcus and Rebecca sat in the front row, their daughter, my granddaughter, on Rebecca's lap. Evelyn and even Charles were there, though he still wore his reserved expression. The stage lights were hot, the crowd restless, the energy electric. When the host introduced me, the audience erupted into applause. I stepped onto the stage, my heart pounding, my bracelet glinting under the lights. I took a deep breath and began. My name is Angela Johnson. Some of you may know me as the author of The Back Table. But before that, I was a mother who worked 3 jobs, a woman who often felt invisible, and someone who once sat at the very back of her own son's wedding. The crowd grew silent, every ear tuned to my words. I want to tell you something, I continued. That night, when I was seated with the staff, I felt humiliated, but when I stood up to speak, something happened. I realized I didn't need anyone's permission to belong. I realized my worth wasn't determined by where someone placed me, but by the life I had lived and the love I had given. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. I wrote The Back Table because I wanted the world to see women like me, women who raise children on their own, who sacrifice without recognition, who are too often told their stories don't matter. But they do matter, every single one. Applause broke out, but I held up my hand, smiling softly. I am not extraordinary because I became an author or because I spoke in Congress. I am extraordinary because I refused to give up. And so are all of you. Every mother who gets up before dawn to pack lunches, every father who works double shifts, every grandmother who holds her family together with nothing but love. You are extraordinary. The audience rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, some wiping tears. After the event, people crowded around me, hugging me, thanking me, pressing my hands. But it was Marcus who reached me first. He wrapped me in a hug so tight I could hardly breathe. Mom, he whispered, you've changed the world, but more than that, you've changed me. I pulled back, tears spilling down my cheeks. And you changed me too, Marcus. You gave me a reason to fight, even when I was tired. You were always my why. Rebecca stepped forward, her eyes shining. And now, you're her daughter's why too. She's going to grow up knowing the strength she comes from. I glanced down at my granddaughter, who clapped her tiny hands as though she understood. I lifted her into my arms, kissing her soft curls. She'll never sit at the back table, I whispered, holding her close. That night, we all went back to Marcus and Rebecca's apartment for a late dinner. The table was full, family, friends, laughter spilling into every corner. Evelyn raised her glass, her voice warm and steady. To Angela, she said, the woman who reminded us all what it means to stand tall. Thank you for teaching us, for humbling us, and for showing us that dignity belongs to everyone. Even Charles lifted his glass, his eyes meeting mine. For once, there was no reservation, no judgment, only respect. I raised my own glass, my heart swelling. To family, to love, to never letting anyone decide where we belong. The clinking of glasses rang like music. Later, After everyone had gone home and the apartment had grown quiet, I sat on the balcony with Marcus. The city lights glimmered below, the night air cool on our faces. You know, he said softly, I still think about that wedding, about how wrong it all was. I shook my head gently. Don't carry that guilt, son. It was painful, yes, but it gave me the push I needed. Without that moment, I might never have found my voice. He leaned against the railing, his expression thoughtful. Funny how something meant to break you ended up building you stronger. I smiled faintly. That's life. It doesn't always give us what we want, but it gives us what we need. Even when it hurts, we sat in silence for a while, the city humming around us, before Marcus spoke again. Mom, he said, his voice thick with emotion, I promise you my daughter will grow up knowing she comes from strength. She'll never doubt her worth, because she'll always have you as an example. Tears pricked my eyes. I reached for his hand, squeezing it. That's all I could ever ask for. As I finally headed home that night, I felt a deep sense of peace settle over me. The humiliation that had once threatened to crush me had become the foundation of something far greater than I ever imagined. I had been placed at the back table. Yes, but I had stood up, raised my glass, and claimed my place. Not just at the wedding, not just in my family, but in the world. And now, as I looked ahead, I knew my story wasn't over. There would always be more to fight for, more voices to uplift, more tables where women needed to be seen. But I also knew this. No one could ever erase me again, because I had turned shame into strength, invisibility into visibility, silence into power. And in doing so, I had built a legacy of dignity, love, and resilience, one that would live on in my son, my granddaughter, and everyone who ever heard my story. I smiled into the quiet night and whispered, not to anyone in particular but to myself, I belong. I always did.